there's growing consensus that we have managed ourselves into a situation where any path out is going to be fairly dramatic and transforming. And then the question is, how dramatic, how transforming? Can it be managed? Is it a human-initiated crisis? And can it therefore be managed by human management strategies? Or are we no more than the ant before the hurricane? And this, just in the warp and woof of the evolution of the planet, we have come now to a period of dissolution and chaotic recasting. I'm interested personally in, I guess in a way, all my interests lead back to history, to the human experience on the planet, which I take to be an extraordinarily peculiar variant on nature, that something very unusual has lodged itself in this particular species of higher primate. And through technology, through an ability to create omni-adaptable responses to the changing environment, we have ratcheted ourselves into a place of planetary domination, to the point where now all that stands between us and some kind of angelic completion of some sort is the dark side of ourselves and the unpaid bills of the historical process. I've been here for 10 days, and there's been a lot of talk already under the bridge in terms of anything we might say to each other or take away from these meetings. I am a resolute optimist of a very complicated sort, and it troubles me that I have to say of a very complicated sort, because I just always thought of myself as an optimist. But I realize, listening to people play back what they imagine they've heard me say, that it comes off as scary to some people, because I'm not a conservative of any sort. I don't think very much of what we have created is going to survive the keyhole through which we must pass to get to a sane world beyond the contradictions of a dwindling environment and a rapacious economic system and enormous power concentrated in the hands of a few, enormous misery experienced by vast numbers of people. Because my faith, based on, basically just a lifetime of edge running, living in marginal societies, taking psychedelic drugs, spending time with Aboriginal people, staying out of America during some of its more dramatic convulsions. All that has led to the conclusion for me that the thing we are caught up in is not our fault, nor can it be managed by goodwill. And since there doesn't seem to be much, that's sort of a moot question anyway. The thing that we are caught up in is what we have been caught up in for a very long time. The oldest skeletons of Homo sapiens sapien, the double-thinking hominid, are 100,000 years old. They didn't spring from nowhere. Probably Homo sapiens sapien is 150 to 200,000 years old on this planet. And in us, nature has decided to take a very dramatic set of chances. And though the results are not in, essentially it appears that it's going to come out in the next couple of decades. I think that nature is the great source of optimism, in all of this, that history, far from being the harbinger of extinction and catastrophe, as it's interpreted by linear empirical thinkers, is instead a slow dawning of a transcendental possibility that, cast its light over essentially at least 1 million years of human becoming, and that from the very beginning of the stirrings of self-reflection, the observation of the rising of setting of stars on the horizon, the observation that, sex is linked to procreation, the dimmest awareness in our species has been pointed toward the revelation of a something that is in the biology of the planet. And history, as we have experienced it since the fall of Rome, an endless ebb and flow of dynastic rulership, expanded technological capability, expanded coding systems, so forth and so on, and history, as we have experienced it since, say, 1900, an ever-expanding electromagnetic sphere of information transfer, an ever more dramatic collapse of distances and boundaries. History is not simply the record of the random walk of a higher animal. It is, in fact, the thing which we have been, I think, most taught to suspect, which is, it is the inner penetration of the humdrum of biology with something extra-dimensional, transcendental, if you wish, even godlike, if you wish, although I don't go that far. It's not, to my mind, we're not talking about the God who hung the stars like lamps in heaven, as Milton said. We're talking about the secret agenda of bios on the planet, that it is complete hubris to believe that you can escape from the yoke of nature, the domain of natural constraints. It can't happen. What is happening to us is devastating, to be sure, dramatic, possibly unique in the history of the planet, but not unnatural or unexpected. It is simply the consequence of intelligence reaching a certain level of mastery over its environment and the stuff of itself. And, we will talk about all this in high detail, or as much as we can, over the course of the meetings. What I just want to say this evening to sort of set the stage, and those of you who've read my books will recognize the theme. The reason I believe that we have reached an end to the historical journey is because now the only metaphors which make any sense are the metaphors that lie outside of history. The whole of the 20th century can be understood as an enormous turning in the mind of Western civilization toward the archaic, toward the prehistorical. And we who have grown up, visiting the Hall of Dinosaurs at the American Museum of Natural History and so forth, this is not such a big deal for us. But this dimension to our lives is very new and very modern. Bishop Usser believed that the world was created in 4004 BC. That was a reasonable opinion to be held by a member of the British intelligentsia 150 years ago. When the cave paintings at Lascaux were discovered by shepherds in the south of France, they brought the great men from the academies at Paris to view these things, and they assured their discoverers that they had doubtless been done by members of the Grand Army of Napoleon who had overwintered there in the winter of 1812. The idea that these paintings could have been done 25,000 years ago by human beings was utterly inconceivable. The idea that the earth could have a history that would reach back 4,000 million years is an entirely modern understanding of what is possible. And in this discovery of the archaic, from paleontology, from archaeology, also comes an awareness that much of the world, until very recently, has remained archaic, that tribal structures set in place at the melting of the last glaciers are in place today in many parts of the world, with very complex social structures, religious beliefs, theories of polity, medicine, so forth and so on. But medicine, the key concept here, because these Aboriginal societies that have kept the archaic toolkit, when we sort through that toolkit, there's more there than fish poisons and abortifacients and even contraceptives. What there are psychedelic plants. And again, those of us who have grown up with the assumption of psychedelic plants or even synthetic psychedelic chemistry tend to forget that this has all arrived on the plate of Western civilization in the last 100 years. You know, mescaline was characterized in 1888, harmine in 1928, LSD discovered in 37, not really known until after the war, psilocybin 53, DMT 56, everything made illegal in 66. These things are very new on in the catalog of the artefactoria that we have looted from cultures around the world. And because they are illegal, very little is known about them. The issues raised in the 1960s around these substances have never been settled. The use of them was savagely repressed. The government proved it could repress, but it never was then able to deliver on the only excuse there is for government repression, which is the prosecution of a reasonable social agenda. That never happened. But more is at stake here than American civilization and its attitude towards psychedelics. The whole of the 20th century is characterized by this nostalgia for the archaic. It begins when Picasso brings African masks to Paris in 1910. It even begins earlier than that, when Impressionism deconstructs the photographic realism of late Romanticism and instead turns everything into shimmering light and surfaces. Certainly, pataphysics and Dada, the precursors of surrealism, were, attacks on the sensibilities of the petty bourgeois, for sure, but also a breaking up of the expectations of linear time that had been created in the West since the Industrial Revolution generally. A whole bunch of things, we don't have to dwell on them, but jazz, abstract expressionism, sexual permissiveness, rock and roll, body piercing, house dancing, all of these things are characterized by a nostalgia for the archaic. And I think that this means we have come full circle. Mircea Eliade said this, actually. He said, 20th century culture has the character of a terminal delirium. As we sink toward cultural death, the last 20,000 years of cultural endeavor are swirling around the deathbed in a kind of hallucinogenic storm. We publish every religious text of every cult, of every persuasion anywhere in the world. All ruins must be excavated. All artifacts must be reconstructed and studied in one last, final, frantic effort to make sense of it all as we sense ourselves sinking toward, and that's the question, toward what? Toward the yawning grave, toward the fate we probably richly deserve for the way we've conducted our culture over the past 5,000 years? Or, is there the equivalent of a deus ex machina in this story? Is the U.S. cavalry disguised as friendly extraterrestrials or God's avenging angelic horde about to sweep into this sad story and help us out? Well, I sort of come down halfway in between there. I think that built in to our story is the structure of nature, which, believe it or not, supports us in the incredibly peculiar endeavor of history. Because I think nature is an engine for the production and conservation of novelty. I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, this is the idea which, if you don't understand the mathematics, if you don't take the drugs, if you can't, nevertheless, here's what's being pushed here. The idea that nature conserves novelty, and that this is what evolution of higher plants and animals and culture and 20th century life is about. We are the heirs, multiplied in our wealth many times, of a continuous bequeathment of novelty from one generation to another over vast amounts of space and time. And what is important about this is that it changes fundamentally how you think about being a human being. Because if you are embedded in secular scientism, the official faith of the realm, then you know that we are just a kind of animal, that our planet is not particularly unusual, that our star is typical, our galaxy is ho-hum, and everything is just terribly dreary, uniform, and uninteresting, and you should just be damn glad that there's anything at all to talk about. In other words, the conclusion of modernity is that any meaning life may have has to be, in the phrase of the existentialists, conferred. That means you put it on it. You say you're important, and that makes you important. You say you have hope, and that means you have hope. But the idea that there is any external source making any comment on your being at all is thought to be a childish 19th century notion, now transcended by our more sophisticated reading of things, etc., etc. I don't believe this. I believe that the idea that nature conserves novelty moves the human enterprise back to where it was 1,000 years ago in terms of making what we do important, making our acts of brutality and kindness to each other somehow more important than simply the importance that existentialism would confer upon these things, that somehow we are actors in a drama that requires a certain kind of denouement, or it fails in some sense. And the basis for such an idea is the datum that is provided by the psychedelic experience. And so then this is a big domain for controversy, because If you have the psychedelic experience in your inventory of experiences, you are able to make a different model of reality than if you lack it. It's just like somebody who's never been to Paris. You know, if they don't have that experience, there's a whole set of triangulations on being human that are going to be sort of hard to carry out for them. And this is not, for me, a metaphor. It's much stronger because I don't think that what the shaman is doing is something metaphorical or analogical or allegorical. What the shaman is doing is something real that is couched in a language that we find difficult to understand. And here is the notion that that consciousness seeks the shape of its vessel, that it is like water. You know, you put water in a wine glass and it takes that shape. You put it in a champagne flute and it takes that shape. Consciousness takes the shape of its vessel. And consciousness, in the long, long period when we were much more at prey to the forces of nature, consciousness evolved into a threat detection device of superb sensitivity, so that approaching saber-toothed tigers, so forth and so on, were anticipated and dealt with in a secure, reassuring, dark environment under the influence of psychotropic plants. The structures of consciousness put in place by cultural programming are dissolved, melted, eliminated, and in silent darkness, the mind recasts itself in its own natural geometry, unconfined by three-dimensional space and time. And this is, I stress, not a metaphor. This actually happens. This is how it is that shamans can perform apparent miracles. Shamans, recall, predict weather, predict game movement, cure illnesses, and have an uncanny insight into the secret business of the social group, like who's sleeping with who stole the chicken, that who beat who up in the garden, that kind of thing. Well, I maintain that this is real, this supraordinary knowledge, and it is gained by virtue of unfolding the shamanic imagination in a superspace, a cultural superspace that is higher dimensional, not in a metaphorical sense, but as a mathematician would use the term. If you had a profound insight into the future, then next week's weather would not pose a problem for you to discuss. Where the game is going to be would be a fairly transparent matter. And who's sleeping with who, this sort of thing, this would simply be present, apparent, on the surface of things, yet hidden to ordinary members of the culture because of cultural programming. Well, the fascination then with psychedelics in our culture is, I think, a desire for this same end, to glimpse the end of the historical process and to transcend the creode of cultural programming that has been so deeply worn in us since the Renaissance. So, and this then is the culmination. I'm bringing it around here full circle, believe it or not. This then is the culmination of this archaic impulse. At the center of the archaic impulse is the shaman. At the center of the shaman's understanding of the world is the boundary-dissolving experience of psychedelics. And what is interesting to me is I see a strange fractal parallelism in all of this. History is like a psychedelic experience. It is, it begins on the plains of Africa, history, natural, ordered, dynamic, given. And then it's as though we drift into a dream of energy, a dream of conquest over each other, a dream of interaction with strange higher powers that trade in gnosis and lead us toward sacrifice and revelation and the codification of human rules for our societies and magical insights into how to get to the side of the angels, so forth and so on. And this builds and builds. It becomes not merely slightly strange, mud cities, priests, slavery. It becomes very strange. You get Greek mathematics. You get Roman science. You get the rise of world-ruling imperiums and an ever-elaborating technology that feeds in upon itself faster and faster and faster, imaging the human Faustian desire to go beyond itself somehow. And now, in the 20th century, we're over the top or into the fourth hour or something, because we can call down the energies that burn in the stars themselves. We primates, we monkeys do this. We light the fires that burn at the very center of the stars that shine at night. This is an extraordinary feat of biology. I mean, it's not the feat of an ideology. It's the feat of biology, that the stuff of protoplasm that runs on energies less than those of a triple flashlight battery can hurl instruments outside the solar system, decode the DNA, so forth and so on. Well, what it is leading toward is an imaging of this object in the imagination that has always been there, always driven our aesthetic concerns, our art, our poetry, dimly glimpsed in orgasm, glimpsed in psychedelic ecstasy, fits of aesthetic creation, so forth and so on. And now, at the end of this process, and with incredible speed, all the secrets are being told, all the veils are being lifted, all the doors are being opened. It's that deathbed delirium that Merciliade was talking about. So that's all I wanted to say about that. It's the part you needed to hear is that nature conserves novelty, that in that enterprise history has been created, and in the furtherance of that enterprise history will be transcended, and soon. And the way to get with the program is to anticipate it by following the shamans into hyperspace. That's what I was trying to say.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What did you mean by we're at a historical end?
Well, that you cannot imagine, sitting where we are tonight, that a phrase like 500 years from now or 100 years from now, it has absolutely no meaning. In 1800, you could speak of 100 years from now, but the accelerated rate of change is now so intense that that we are confronted with a number of trends that when you extend the curve out 30 years, it reaches infinity. So a continuation of the historical process as we've known it for several thousand years is impossible to imagine. Is that all you want to say? Is ask a question? Okay. Yeah, I always, when I was a little kid, I used to hear about the end of the novel. Not a novel, the novel. And also the end of the symphony. And I just thought this was such a hard concept to grasp. And then, I've made my living out of the end of history, which when most people hear that phrase for the first time, it's a mind-boggling concept. I mean, how can history end? Isn't it the stuff of which reality is made? Turns out, no, it's just a funny kind of notion. It was invented by Germans, and it'll be put away by them, probably. Yeah. Yes, it's interesting how resistant people are to the concept of the possibility of the end of the world, as though that violates some innate order of things, when it's perfectly obvious that it's a fairly academic discussion compared to the absolute certainty of the end of your world. You being you, me, and everybody. I mean, the end of the world is built in. It's just this technicality about whether it happens to everybody when it happens to you, or it just happens to you.
That we're in hyperspace.
Yeah, we're in hyperspace. I've been heralding it for years, and I'm just about to the place where I'm willing to say it is happening. It's not coming. It's like the little girl says in Poltergeist, they're here. They're here. But it's an appalling thing to grapple with.
Does it believe you, challenge you?
Well, believing me, if you know me well, I don't believe me. I hate ideology. And I think the way to keep it light is to not believe. I will attempt to convert you in the course of these meetings to all kinds of things that I don't believe. I figure, I could throw it off. You can throw it off. I think ideology is poisonous. We're not trying to figure out the best thing to believe. What we're trying to do is not believe anything and somehow have a return to the direct empowering of common sense and common senses. That's why the psychedelic experience is so central to me, because it's an experience. You can say that it's like Kundalini yoga, or you can say that it's like a visitation from the Virgin Mary, but what it is an experience. And then I can tell you, well, based on my psychedelic experiences, I think the world is thus and so, but you can take the psychedelic experience and leave what I think about it or what anybody thinks about it behind. It's an experience. And in terms of figuring out what the world is, it's indispensable, I think, that we are all infantilized by a cultural machinery. I like to say culture is not your friend. It's not your friend, all this stuff. It infantilizes you because it provides answers. The culture has answers. Work hard, make money, be a good Christian, Jew, Muslim, whatever. And culture is not your friend. The psychedelic experience is a primary recasting of experience. It's as profound as sex. It's like sex. In fact, they would make sex illegal if they could, for the very reasons that psychedelics are illegal. It's just they can't, it's in the bone. They can't get it out of us. But it is that same kernel of chaos that drives them crazy, that makes it very hard to control a social agenda. Well, anyway, not to rave about that, but yeah.
Speak of a movement of evolution. I think it's something that's happening to a lot of people, and it's a movement forward for all of us. So I'm just interested in, hearing more about that and speaking some things and whatever.
Good. You mean by you have your foot in both worlds, that you're interested in shamanism and you are somehow involved in technology?
The opposite. Actually, I'm very involved in shamanism, and I'm finishing up my doctorate in, working with computers and doing all that.
Uh-huh.
And it's much easier to be involved in shamanism and multidimensional reality and to move in those worlds than it is to do the academic thing.
Well, the net is sort of like the shamanic other place, and getting more so, I think. Because it's a domain defined by language. And the faith of magic is that the world is made of language. That's really the difference. The fundamental difference between science and magic is that science believes there is something, what Whitehead called stubborn facts, which need to be illuminated. And the magician knows that the world is being created by linguistic intent. Yeah, I think the more I think about it, that the challenge is not to fight the people who have bad ideas, which is ordinarily what politics is about. You fight the Nazis or the somebody or others, but to have good ideas. Because the people who have bad ideas are going to be defeated by the circumstances. You don't have to do anything. There will come a moment when if you have good ideas, they will plead with you to help bail them out. First, of course, they're going to try all the bad ideas. I mean, my notion of progress is it's when good things occur for all the wrong reasons. If we can find the wrong reasons, the right things will occur. Something like the Soviet Union falling apart. It fell apart for all the wrong reasons. Similarly, much of the future, I think, is going to be ruled by this principle. They don't do things out of altruism. They do things in order to serve a system already in place. That's why when you try to think of solutions, think of things that will simultaneously enrich people. If we could find a way to make self-interest and community interest the same thing, we'd have it like that, because everybody would pitch in on that program. Yeah. Yeah, well, you mentioned science fiction. I would certainly confess that science fiction was the entry-level drug for me. So many people have an aversion to it, and all science fiction is a permissioning of imagination. It's the how would it be if clause worked out to its ultimate. And it also teaches you, the way in which the future exceeds the wildest imagining. I mean, I remember Robert Heinlein, when he published his book Universe, the people on their way to the moon have slide rules, which they're always whipping out and fiddling with, because he got part of it right, but he didn't get that part right. And all of those futures in science fiction are simply, in a sense, modeling for what works and what doesn't. I think, Melville said reality outruns apprehension. I'm not sure he meant what I think he means, but certainly in the 20th century, reality has outrun apprehension. Things are far weirder than anybody anticipated. Even the weirdest among us have been overreached. I remember when I was 16, I read William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, mostly for pornographic reasons, but it seemed to me it was like the ravings of a diseased intellect. It was so unhinged. Now it reads like the sober musings of a concerned social critic. So that's what we were able to achieve in 30 years. Well, before I let you go this evening, I should self-promote briefly. The Invisible Landscape is back in print. It was published originally in 1975 and had a very small print run then. At the time, it was said that it was 50 years ahead of its time. So now I guess we're down to 30 years ahead of its time. In somewhat ways, this is our best book. This is not our easiest book or our most friendly book. This is the most uncompromising because it's our stab at immortality, basically. I mean, this is our Principia, our Prolegomena, our and it's also our most, and the use of our, meaning my brother and myself, the most speculative of all the books. I think that the bookstore tried to stock everything, and what everything means is this book and Food of the Gods, which is a book defending and reviewing the history of psychedelic use and suggesting that it was an evolutionary force shaping consciousness, suggesting and defending the fairly radical idea that if it weren't for psychedelic plants, there would be no conscious monkeys on this planet. That in fact, this is the missing chemical trigger in the environment that can account for the explosive evolutionary speed with which the human brain established itself on the scene. We can talk more about that tomorrow. Also a book of essays called The Archaic Revival, which I talked about the Archaic Revival tonight, although I'm not sure I used that phrase. And then, if you're not into didacticism, a book that I wrote called True Hallucinations, which is a travel, adventure, science fiction narrative, except that every word is true, and I will stand behind it and defend it. Being that every word is true, no claim is made that the dead walk or that Lemuria will rise from beneath the sea, but small violations of natural law are very important in the real world, not if you're Carlos Castaneda or something, but in my world, even small violations of physics get real celebration around the dinner table. Also, they have some copies, those of you who are more practically minded and perhaps more impecunious than some of the rest of us might want to look at Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. And then you can produce a dependable supply of genetically certified pure psilocybin and delight your roommates and perhaps pay some of your bills as well. And I think that covers the waterfront. I'm at a place in my life which is sort of gratifying and sort of not, which is that everything I've ever written is now in print. The problem with that is surely within a matter of months, one or another will slip out of print, and then I will have that unmistakable feeling that I'm over the top. But it will be true, so what's the point of evading it? I mean, the 20th century has seen too much of occult arm-waving, theosophical pontification, and burning-eyed visionaries with this, that, or the other brand of hokum that they're peddling. The rules of evidence are clear, and whether you are asserting that you were told by a flying saucer or you decoded the scripts of Lemuria or what it is you're claiming, the rules of evidence are clear. And it must make sense. And the truth does not require your belief. The truth is perfectly capable of sustaining itself no matter what you think about it. And the attitude somehow that we must be careful with the truth and not bang on it to see if it can take the heat is wrong. In that, I'm thoroughly scientific. And the best ideas can survive this. It's only the somehow compromised or not thoroughly thought through, or yes, the half-baked. They can't survive this test, but the truth can. And in the spiritual and intellectual marketplace of the present, there's nothing at all wrong with applying a sophisticated eye to the ideological hardware and software that's being touted. Yeah.
Something like that we think it's a metaphor. And I just wondered if you get more specific in what you meant, like the language that shamans use or something like that.
Well, for example, if quantum physics has a whole bunch of terms which appear transparent and trivial. Spin, charm, and because these are words in common speech, but charm has nothing to do with charm, and beauty has nothing to do with beauty. Beauty being another one of these quantum mechanical terms. So the anthropologist goes to the shaman and says, tell me what's the deal with how you're relating to the cosmos. And the shaman says something like, well, we can cure people through the power of ancestor spirits. Cure people through the power of ancestor spirits. Each one of these words is an abyss of ambiguity that is culturally defined and very hard to communicate. The anthropologist tiles over the Witoto or Muinani or Warani intent with a European understanding of what these things mean, cure, ancestor, spirit, and then goes away with the idea that these people are naive and childish and full of quaint, primitive notions that positivism has allowed us to transcend. No real communication has taken place. That's why the only way, I'm not even sure anthropology is a worthwhile enterprise in the I will go and describe other cultures style. But if it is, then you have to go somehow inside. And that means, certainly a lifetime of relationship, certainly a complete assimilation of the language, and certainly if there are drugs to be taken or deals to be had, unusual sexual or social arrangements that are expected, you have to submit to that, or you're not, you can't understand it. Language is a strange thing. It's very localized. You almost could say that, think about it, it's a weird thing. You are born out of the body of woman somewhere on the planet, and very much the grid coordinates of where you were born will determine your reality forever after, because you imbibe a local language. You immediately begin to learn Swedish or English or Chinese, and then though you may travel great distances and live among very different people, in a sense you always see through the linguistic lens, the very parochial linguistic lens of the place where you originated. I've made a number of trips to the Amazon. When I first started going, I was basically a professional butterfly collector on one level. And to me, the Amazon just seemed immensely variegated in its greenness. It was an unending thing of green. Later, when I went back with people getting their PhDs under Schultes in the botany department at Harvard and lived cheek by jowl for weeks with these guys, I quickly learned plant families, genera, taxonomic terms, all kinds of genetic terms, and as I could pour this language into the greenery, it became endlessly discussable and hence, interesting and defined for me intellectually. Yeah, I mean, it's very much part of my intellectual story that I'm basically making my living by speaking English, but my relationship to languages is a long and sad one. I've spent years and years in South America and Mexico, and my Spanish is atrocious. I spent a long time in Indonesia, learned practically none. My career as an Asian scholar, an Asian art historian, was ended when I went to Nepal and studied Tibetan and realized, that I was never going to get it. And somewhere along the way, I failed Italian, German, Hebrew. I think that's about it. But it's some kind of weird thing where it just doesn't take in me. And so my only option has been to explore English as though it were many languages, scientific English, Chaucerian English, the English of art criticism, the English of scientific journalism, on and on and on. And so it's a kind of a response to not being able to assimilate the other. I think people who speak many languages, I'm more in awe of that than almost anything else.
Geological / botanical information relating to psychedelics.
No, I have only two original ideas as far as I can tell, and one of them we'll get to later, and the other one you have stumbled into like an ant into an antlion's pit. You see, there's great kudos to be had to anyone who can convincingly explain within the confines of Darwinian theory as modified by molecular genetics, how in the world the human thing got going and what could have possibly happened, because the orthodox theory of evolution is just splendid for handling the evolution of grasses, the emergence of prairie dogs and elephants and bee colonies and so forth. It's the human presence on the planet that is so jarring to biology, because we emerged very, very quickly. Uniquely among all species on the planet, Homo sapiens sapien, the double-thinking man, emerged within 1.5 million years. And it involved a doubling in brain size from the previous model. And this has been called by Lumholtz, who's one of the doyens of orthodox evolutionary biology, the most explosive expansion of a major organ of a higher animal in the entire fossil record. And it's a great embarrassment to evolutionary theory for that reason, but the embarrassment is deepened when you realize that this particular organ that we're talking about is not the pancreas of a horseshoe crab or the chewing parts of a beetle. It's the organ which produced the theory of evolution. It's the human brain. So the organ which produced the theory cannot be accounted for by the theory. This is a great embarrassment. And the problem is time. Given 50 million years, the brain could have doubled along the lines of natural selection, random mutation. But it happened in 1.5 million. So there was some extraordinary selective pressure on these hominids. And if you could figure out what it is or what it was, you would be carried on the backs of your comrades to a Nobel Prize in biology, presumably. Finnegan's Wake is the last and most ambitious and most puzzling work of the British writer James Joyce, who of course wrote Dubliners and Ulysses. And if Ulysses is the algebra of literature, then Finnegan's Wake is the partial differential equation. Most of us break down at algebra. Few of us aspire to go on to the partial linear differential equation. In some ways, I think it can arguably be said that this is the quintessential work of art, or at least work of literature, of the 20th century. And Joyce intended it that way. Joseph Campbell called it a staggering allegory of the fall and redemption of mankind. Equally respected critics have called it a surrender to the crossword puzzle portion of the human mind. Mm-hmm. So the main thing about it is that it is linguistically dense. It is dense on every level. It has over 63,000 individual words in it. That's more words than most fictional manuscripts have, words, period. It has over 5,000 characters in it. Ulysses was designed as a kind of, Joyce thought of it as his day book. It follows the peregrinations of an ordinary Dubliner, this is Ulysses, an ordinary Dubliner through the vicissitudes of his day, his struggles to buy some kidneys to fry for breakfast, his chance meeting with his wife's lover, so forth and so on. Fairly straightforward exposition of the techniques of literature that have been perfected in the 20th century, stream of consciousness, so forth and so on, slice of life. Finnegan's Wake was designed to be the night book to that day book. So it was conceived of as a dream, and one of the questions that undergraduates are asked to shed ink over is, whose dream is it? And what is this book about? I mean, when you first pick it up, it's absolutely daunting. There doesn't seem to be a way into it. It seems to be barely in English. And the notion, that one could, by spending time with this, tease out characters, plot, literary tension, resolution, this sort of thing, seems fairly unlikely. Actually, it's one of the few things that really repays pouring effort into it. The first 25 pages are incredibly dense, and most people are eliminated somewhere in those first 25 pages, and so never really, it's a language, and you have to gain a facility with it, and you have to cheat. That's the other thing. And there's lots of help cheating, because it has spawned a great exegetical literature, all kinds of pale scholars eager to give you the Celtic word lists of Finnegan's Wake, or a discussion of the doctrine of the transubstantiation in Finnegan's Wake, or so forth and so on. Hundreds of these kinds of doctoral theses in Comp Lit have been ground out over the decades. The reason I'm interested in it, I suppose I should fess up, is because it's two things, clearly. Finnegan's Wake is psychedelic, and it is apocalyptic / eschatological. And what I mean by those phrases is, first of all, what I mean by psychedelic is there is no stable point of view. There is no character per se. You never know who is speaking. You have to read into each speech to discover, is this King Mark, Anna Livia Plurabelle, Humphrey Chimpdenere Wicker, Shem the penman, Sean, who is it? And identities are not fixed. Those of you who have followed my rap over the years, I'm always raving about how psychedelics dissolve boundaries. Well, Finnegan's Wake is as if you had taken the entirety of the last 1,000 years of human history and dissolved all the boundaries. So Queen Mab becomes Mae West. All the personages of pop culture, politics, art, church history, Irish legend, Irish internecine politics are all swirling, changing, merging. Time is not linear. You will find yourself at a recent political rally, then return to the court of this or that Abyssinian emperor or pharaoh. It's like a trip. And the great technique, I was thinking about this as I was thinking about this lecture, the great technique of the 20th century is collage or pastiche. It was originally developed by the Dadaists in Zurich in 1919. Right now it's having a huge resurgence in the form of sampling in pop music. And Joyce was the supreme sampler. I mean, he draws his material from technical catalogs, menus, legal briefs, treaty language, mythologies, dreams, doctor-patient conversations. Everything is grist for this enormous distillery. And yet, what comes out of this, once you learn the codes and once you learn to play the game, is a Joycean story that all graduates of Ulysses will recognize. I mean, what Joyce was about was an incredible sympathy with common people and an awareness of the dilemma of being a Jew in Irish Ireland, being a devotee of scholasticism in the 20th century, of dislocation and disorientation, of being the cuckolded husband, of being the failed divinity student. All of these characters and themes are familiar. It's quite an amazing accomplishment. There's nothing else like it in literature. It had very little anticipation. The only real anticipator of Joyce in English, I think, is Thomas Nash, who most people have never heard of. Thomas Nash was a contemporary of Shakespeare and wrote a famous, I don't know what that means in such a context, but a novel called it was called The Wayfaring Traveler. Anyway, Nash had this megalomaniac richness of language, this attitude that it's better to put it in than take it out. And that's certainly what you get with Joyce. I mean, Joyce is so dense with technical terms, brand names, pop references, localisms. The way to conceive of Finnegan's Wake really is like a midden, a garbage dump. And there is, in fact, a garbage dump in the wake that figures very prominently. And what you, as the reader, have to do is go in there with nut pick and toothbrush and essentially remove one level after another level after another level and sink down and down. And the theme is always the same, the delivery of the word, the misinterpretation of the word, and the redemption of the word at every level in all times and places. The reason I'm now gone some distance toward explaining why I think of it as psychedelic, the reason why I think of it as eschatological and apocalyptic is because he really it's hard to tell. We don't have James Joyce around to ask how much of this material he took seriously and how much of it was grist for his literary mill. But he was perfectly conversant with Renaissance theories of magic. The entire book is based on La Scienza Nuova of Giambattista Vico, who was I don't even know what you would call him, a Renaissance sociologist, basically, and systems theorist. And Joyce once in a famous interview said that if the whole universe were to be destroyed and only Finnegan's Wake survive, that the goal had been that then the entire universe could be reconstructed out of this. Some of you who are students of Torah, this is a very Talmudic idea that somehow a book is the primary reality. The idea in Hasidism in some schools is that all of the future is already contained in the Torah, and then when you ask them, well, if it's contained there, then isn't it predestined? And the answer is no, because the letters are scrambled, and only the movement of the present moment through the text correctly unscrambles and arranges the letter. This is Joyce thinking, for sure. And it's very close to a central theme in Joyce and a central theme in the Western religious tradition, which is the coming into being, the manifestation of the Word, the declension of the Word into matter. And in a sense, what Joyce was trying to do was, he was in that great tradition of literary alchemy whose earlier practitioners were people like Robert Flood, Athanasius Kircher, Paracelsus. These are not familiar names, but in the late flowering of alchemy, when the birth of modern science the rosy glow could already be seen, the alchemists turned toward literary allegory in the 16th and early 17th century. Joyce is essentially in that tradition. I mean, this is an effort to condense the entire of experience, all as Joyce says in The Wake, all space-time in a nutshell is what we're searching for here. A kind of philosopher's stone of literary associations from which the entire universe can be made to blossom forth. And the way it's done is through pun and tricks of language and double and triple and quadruple entendre. No word is opaque. Every word is transparent, and you see through it to older meanings, stranger associations. And as your mind tries to follow these associative trees of connection, you eventually you get the feeling, which is the unique feeling that the wake gives you, which is, it's about as close to LSD on the page as you can get, because you are simultaneously many points of view, simultaneously many dramatis loci, many places in the plot, and the whole thing is riddled with resonance. A man doing a task on one level is on another level a Greek god completing a task, and on another level some other figure of some more obscure mythology. So really, one thing about Finnegan's Wake, it's like a dipstick for your own intelligence. What you bring to it is going to determine what you get out. And if you have read the books which Joyce was familiar with, or if you have armed yourself with such simple things as a Fodor's Guide to Ireland, or a good map of Ireland, or a good work of Irish mythology, then it immediately begins to betray its secrets to you. And it's so rich that it's easy to make original discoveries. It's easy to see and understand things which probably have not been seen or understood since James Joyce put it there, because he had this kind of all-inclusive intelligence. Maybe I didn't make clear enough why that, to my mind, is an eschatological phenomena, this production of the Philosopher's Stone. It's because it's about the union of spirit and matter. That's what the Philosopher's Stone is about. And writing a book which aspires to be the seed for a living world is about the union of spirit and matter as well. And the Christian scenario of redemption at the end of profane history is another scenario of transubstantial union of spirit and matter. This seems to be, in fact, the overarching theme of Finnegan's Wake and of the 20th century. In terms of the temporal context for this book, it was finished in 1939, a few months before 1939, and Joyce died early in 1939. In a sense, he died in one of the most science fiction moments of the 20th century, because the Third Reich was going strong. It had not yet been pegged down a notch. Schemes of eugenics and 1,000-year racially purified super civilizations, all of that crazy early 40s stuff was happening. And the book is surprisingly modern. Television appears, psychedelic drugs appear, all of these things appear. I mean, presciently, he was some kind of a prophet. And also, he understood the 20th century sufficiently that the part he hadn't yet lived through was as transparent to him as the part that he had. He could see what was coming. Well, that's by way of my introduction. I want to read you what some other people have said about this, because I don't think I can say enough on my own. This is the indispensable book, if you're serious about this, a skeleton key to Finnegan's Wake. And it takes the view that we don't know what this thing is, so we have to go through it literally, line by line. And he tells you the story, and the entire story, in the 1-page version, in the 10-page version, and in the 200-page version. And even in the 200-page version, there are sections where Campbell simply reports, the next 5 pages are extremely obscure. Mark it. But this is just a short section. And one of the things about working with the wake is you become, at first, this language, which is so impenetrable and bizarre, it ends up infecting you, and you become unable to write or talk any other way. So I'll read you some of Campbell's introduction, and I think you will see it's like the wake itself, except in baby steps. Introduction to a strange subject. Running riddle and fluid answer, Finnegan's Wake is a mighty allegory of the fall and resurrection of mankind. It is a strange book, a compound of fable, symphony, and nightmare, a monstrous enigma beckoning imperiously from the shadowy pits of sleep. Its mechanics resemble those of a dream which has freed the author from the necessities of common logic and has enabled him to compress all periods of history, all phases of individual and racial development into a circular design of which every part is beginning, middle, and end. In a gigantic wheeling rebus, dim effigies rumble past, disappear into foggy horizons, and are replaced by other images, vague but half-consciously familiar. On this revolving stage, mythological heroes and events of remotest antiquity occupy the same spatial and temporal planes as modern personages and contemporary happenings. All time occurs simultaneously. Tristram and the Duke of Wellington, Father Adam and Humpty Dumpty merge in a single precept. Multiple meanings are present in every line. Interlocking allusions to keywords and phrases are woven like fugal themes into the pattern of the work. Finnegan's Wake is a prodigious, multifaceted monolith, not only the cauchemar of a Dublin citizen, but the dreamlike saga of guilt-stained, evolving humanity. The vast scope and intricate structure of Finnegan's Wake give the book a forbidding aspect of impenetrability. It appears to be a dense and baffling jungle, trackless and overgrown with wanton perversities of form and language. Clearly, such a book is not meant to be idly fingered. It tasks the imagination, exacts discipline and tenacity from those who would march with it. Yet some of the difficulties disappear as soon as the well-disposed reader picks up a few compass clues and gets his bearings. Then the enormous map of Finnegan's Wake begins slowly to unfold. Characters and motifs emerge, themes become recognizable, and Joyce's vocabulary falls more and more familiarly on the accustomed ear. Complete understanding is not to be snatched at greedily in one sitting, or in 50, I might add. Nevertheless, the ultimate state of the intelligent reader is certainly not bewilderment. Rather, it is an admiration for the unifying insight, economy of means, and more than Rabelaisian humor which have miraculously quickened the stupendous mass of material. One acknowledges at last that James Joyce's overwhelming micro-macrocosm could not have been fired to life in any sorcerer furnace, less black, less heavy, less murky than this, his incredible book. He had to smelt the modern dictionary back to protean plasma and reenact the genesis and mutation of language in order to deliver his message. But the final wonder is that such a message could be delivered at all. Every book has to be about something. I mean, so what is this book about? Well, as far as anybody can tell, it appears to be about someone named, well, they have hundreds of names, actually, but for economy's sake, someone named Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, or abbreviated HCE. And Humphrey Earwicker runs a pub in Chapelizod, which is a suburb or a district of London. And he has, as it says, an idyll wifey, who is Annalivia Plurabelle. And now these two people, this barkeep and his wife, and their two children, Jerry and Kevin, or Shem and Sean, and then they also have hundreds of names because they occur on hundreds and hundreds of levels. Every brother struggle in history is enacted by the two boys, Jerry and Kevin. They are Shem the penman and Sean the other one. And they dichotomize certain parts of the process. So here is, in one paragraph, this is the Cliff Notes version of what Finnegan's Wake is all about. If you commit this to memory, you will never be caught wanting at a New York cocktail party. As the tale unfolds, we discover that Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker is a citizen of Dublin, a stuttering tavern keeper with a bull-like hump on the back of his neck. He emerges as a well-defined and sympathetic character, the sorely harrowed victim of a relentless fate, which is stronger than, yet identical with, himself. Joyce refers to him under various names, such as Here Comes Everybody and Haveth Childers Everywhere, indications of his universality and his role as the great progenitor. The hero has wandered vastly, leaving families, that is, deposits of civilization, at every pause along the way from Troy in Asia Minor, he is frequently called the Turk, up through the turbulent lands of the Goths, the Franks, the Norsemen, and overseas to the green isles of Britain and Eire. His chief Germanic manifestations are Woden and Thor, his chief Celtic, Manan and Maclar. Again, he is St. Patrick carrying the new faith. Again, Strongbow leading the Anglo-Norman conquest. Again, Cromwell conquering with a bloody hand. Most specifically, he is our Anglican tavern keeper, HCE, in the Dublin suburb Chapelizod. So, like Ulysses, the ground zero here is the utterly mundane, middle-class, tormented Irish people embedded in the detritus of the 20th century. But there's an effort to never lose the cosmic perspective, never lose the sense that we are, not individuals lost in time, but the front ends of gene streams that reach back to Africa, that we somehow have all these ancestors and conflicts swarming and storming within it. It's a glorious, psychedelic, heartful Irish view of what it is to be embedded in the mystery of existence. Well, okay, enough arm waving. Now let's cut the cake here. River run past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. Sir Tristram, the Lord of Moors fra o'er the short sea, had passing corps re-arrived from North Amorica on this side the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor to welter fight his peninsulate war, nor had Topsawyer's rocks by the stream Oconee exaggerated themselves to Lawrence County Gorgios while they went Dublin their mumber all the time, nor a voice from a fire bellowed Misha, Misha to Tart Toff, thou'rt Patrick. Not yet, though Venice soon after had a kid-scad butt-ended a bland old Isaac. Not yet, though all's fair in vanity, were Sothi Sester's wroth with 2-in-1 Nathan Joe. Rot a peck of Paw's malt had gem or shen brewed by arc light, and Rory end to the Regenbow was to be seen ringsome on the aquaface. The fall. Baba Baba Dalgara Hagatak Amina Arong Kwarak Brontong Nerung Kwabang Varahu Tingat Aktul Hur Dimun Wangamanunuk. Of a once Wall Street old par is retailed early in bed and later on life do it down through all Christian minstrelsy. The great fall of off-wall entailed at such short notice the fit shoot of Finnegan, Earth's solid man, that the Humpty Hill head of himself promptly sends an unquiring one well to the west in quest of his Tumpty Tum-Toes, and their upturned pike toe and place is at the knockout in the park where oranges have been laid to rust upon the green since Devlin's first loved Livy. So, now, granted that the first pages are dense, and it isn't all this dense, because even though the concept of fractals lay years in the future, the effort here is to tell the whole damn thing in the first word, to tell it again in the next 2 words, to tell it again in the next 3 words, and so on. So here in these first roughly 3 paragraphs, a huge amount of information is being passed along. First of all, we're given a location if we're smart enough to know it. River Run, past Even Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Haworth Castle and environs. Well, now, if you know the geography of Dublin, you know that's where you are, because, and notice Haworth Castle and environs is HCE. These initials recur thousands of times in this book, always bringing you back to remind you that this has something to do with Humphrey Earwicker. What this first sentence says is, River Run, and it's the River Liffey, which we will meet in 1,000 reincarnations, because Anna Livia Plurabelle is the personification of the goddess River. The river runs past Even Adams, and there is a church there on the shore named Adam and Eve's in Dublin, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, and then this strange phrase brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation. This announces the great architectonic plan of the wake, that it is in fact going to be based on the sociological ruminations of Giambattista Vico's La Scienza Nuova, the vicus mode of recirculation, because, as I'm sure you all know, Vico's theory of the fall and redemption of mankind was that there were 4 ages. I can't remember, gold, silver, iron, and clay, I think. And so this idea of the recirculation, of the connectedness, of the cyclicity, of the, as he says, the same again and again. Fin again, the same again. And this is one of his great themes, is the recurso. Everything comes again. Nothing is unannounced. Every love affair, every dynastic intrigue, every minor political disgrace, and a minor political disgrace figures very prominently in this book, because as the carrier of Adam's sin, the great dilemma for Humphrey Earwicker is that he is running for a minor political post, alderman, but apparently one night, rather juiced, he relieved himself. Well, there are many versions, and you hear them all, and they are all given in dreams and in mock trials and in accusatory fantasy. He either innocently took a leak in the park, or he fondled himself in some way in the presence of Maggie and her sister in such a way that his reputation is now at great risk. And it all depends on the testimony of a cad, a soldier, or perhaps 3 soldiers. It's never clear. It's constantly shifting. And this question of, what happened when Maggie seen all with her sister in shawl at the magazine wall haunts the book, because on it turns the question of whether HCE is a stalwart pillar of the community, or in fact a backsliding masturbator and a monster, and so forth and so on, as one always is if one is trapped in a James Joyce novel. Then this puzzling list in the second paragraph is simply a list of things which haven't happened yet. Sir Tristram, lover of music, violor d'amours, for o'er the short sea, had passing corps, not yet, re-arrived from North America,
from the coast of Brittany, on this side, the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor, to welterweight his peninsulate war. Now, this word peninsulate is typical Joyce punning. Peninsulate war, obviously, because it's being launched from Brittany. Peninsulate war, because Sir Tristram is the great archetype of the lover, and so his war is peninsulate. Okay, so that's the first thing that has not yet happened, it's telling you. Sir Tristram has not yet come to Ireland, to put it simply. Nor has Top Sawyer's rocks by the stream Oconee exaggerated themselves to Lawrence County Gorgios while they went doubling their mumber all the time. Now, this is further obscurity. There is a stream in Georgia, and Top Sawyer is a reference to Tom Sawyer, because Tom Sawyer was Huck Finn's friend, and Huck Finn is Finn in America. There is a huge amount of Mark Twain that has been poured into these books because of the Huckleberry Finn connection, Finn in the New World. And Top Sawyer's rocks is a reference possibly to testicles and so forth and so on. Every single word, I mean, you can just take a word and go into this and until you exhaust yourself. And then the next thing that has not yet happened, nor a voice from a fire bellowed, Misha, Misha, to Tartuffe, thou art Petric. Tartuffe is Celtic for thou art baptized. So St. Patrick has not yet baptized in Ireland. Not yet, though Venice soon after. And the venison is a pun on venison and very soon. Had a kid-scad butt-ended a bland old Isaac. It's a reference to the Isaac Esau tale in the Bible. It's also a reference to Isaac Butts, who was a figure in the politics of the Irish Rebellion. Not yet, those all spares in vanity, were Sothi Sesters wroth with Tua Nathan Joe. That's, at this point, a very obscure reference, but there is a great incest and sister theme in Finnegan's Wake. And the mistresses of Jonathan Swift become carriers of a huge amount of energy in here, as do the mistresses of Thomas Sterne, because it's better to be Swift than Sterne, or something like that. And then the last of these things which hadn't happened yet, Rot a peck of Paul's malt had gem or shem brewed by arc-light, and Rory end to the Regan brow was to be seen ringsome on the aqua face. That seems pretty obscure to me. According to Joseph Campbell, it's simply a reference to the presence of God moving over the waters in the first lines of Genesis. Ringsome on the aqua face. Then this phrase, the fall, and the multisyllabic word, but that word, these are the Viconian thunders, and they announce the beginning of each Viconian age. And when the thunder speaks, you know then that you're into a transition. Then it actually launches in the last paragraph into a fairly straightforward evocation of at least the mythological Finnegan. As you all probably know, there is an Irish drinking ballad of great antiquity called the Ballad of Tim Finnegan, or the Ballad of Finnegan's Wake. And it tells the story of Tim Finnegan, who was a hod carrier, a bricklayer's assistant, and he was given to hitting the poteen rather hard, and he fell from his ladder It's the Humpty Dumpty story. He fell from his ladder and he broke his back, and his friends waked him in the grand Irish fashion, and at the height of the wake they became so carried away and intoxicated that they upended a bucket of Guinness over his head, and he revived and joined the dance. But this is the resurrection. I mean, Tim Finnigan is very clearly for Joyce a Christ figure. And here is then the first evocation of Tim Finnigan, the fall, then the Viconian thunder, of a once wall-straight old par, which is just an old person, is retailed early in bed and later on life down through all Christian minstrelsy. The great fall of the off-wall entailed at such short notice the shoot of Finnegan. Now this word, P-F-T-J-S-C-H-U-T-E, shoot, is Norwegian, I'm informed, and refers to the act of falling, and the act of falling from a hill. Finnegan, earth's solid man, that the Humpty Hill head of himself promptly sends an unquiring one well to the west in quest of his Tumpty Tum-toes, and their upturned pike point and place is at the knockout in the park, where oranges have been laid to rust upon the green since Devlin's first loved Livy. This is fairly transparent if you're Irish or a citizen of Dublin, because what it's talking about is Dublin is imagined to be situated basically in the belly of an enormous giant person who is Finnegan. Finnegan lies like a giant reclining figure along the Liffey there, husband and wife, river and mountain. And this is actually then, the focus has changed, and now we're talking about the geography. He was a solid man, Earth's solid man, but then somehow he turned into something where the Humpty Hill head of himself promptly sends an unquiring one well to the west in quest of his Tumpty Tum-toes. And if you have a map of Dublin laid out, you can actually see this enormous man in the landscape. And there are many enormous men and women in the landscape of this planet. And Joyce maps the Dublin geography over all of them. Some of you may know Iztaccíhuatl, the magical mountain in Mexico. Iztaccíhuatl means the sleeping woman in Toltec. And many mountains are imagined to be sleeping people. So here he introduces this theme, and this is one paragraph. This is the invocation of Finnegan as hod carrier. Big Mr. Finnegan of the stuttering hand, freeman's mower, lived in the broadest way imaginable in his rush lit too far back for messages before Joshua and Judges had given us numbers or Helviticus commuted Deuteronomy. One yeasty day he sternly strooks his teeth in a tub for to wash the future of his fates. But ere he swiftly took it out again, by the might of Moses, the very water was evaporated, and all the Gunnesses had met their exodus. So that ought to show you what a pension junchy chap he was. And during mighty odd years, this man of hod cement and edifices, HCE, hod cement and edifices, in Topper's Thorpe piled Bildung supra Bildung upon the banks of the livers by the so-and-so. He Iade idle Fifi Annie, ogged the little creature, with her hair in hunds took up your part in her, off while Babulus, mirror ahead, with goodly trowel in grasp and ivory-old overalls which he had particularly fancied, like Harum Childeric Egerberth, He would calculate by multiplicables the altitude and multitude until he seesaw by neat light of the liquor where twint was born his round head stable of other days, to rise in undress masonry upstanded, joy granite, a wallworth of a skier scrape of most Eiffel howeth and towerly, originating from next to nothing, and skating the hymnals and all, higher architectic of flopical, with a burning bush a bob off its bubble top, and with Lawrence O'Tooler's clittering up and Thomas a Bucket's clattering down. Now, what this paragraph says is he was a great builder. And I think if you think back through your impression of hearing it read, you knew that. You know, these words that are associated, words like a wall worth of a skyer scrape of most Eiffel howeth and towerly. These are skyscraper words. Woolworth, skyscrape, in towerly, howeth, so forth and so on. And he can do this. He can build up a pastiche of surfaces, of impressions. Now, you might say, why is there no economy? Well, there is no economy because economy is an aesthetic criterion for shoemakers, not for artists. And, economy is the curse of the Bauhaus babblers from hell, which Joyce was very concerned to refute all of that. If you have to place this in a context, it's in the context of the most hallucinatory of the Baroque. This is Arcamboldo land. This is a work that would have been welcome at the Rudolphine court in Prague. It's a work of magical complexity and enfolded self-reference. Now, we've just been through these first 4 paragraphs. Now I'll read you what Joseph Campbell has to say on it. By no means all of what he has to say on it. The first 4 paragraphs are the suspended tick of time between a cycle just past and one about to begin. They are, in effect, an overture, resonant with all the themes of Finnegan's Wake. The dominant motif is the polylingual thunderclap of paragraph 3, Baba Baba Daru your woman, that one, which the voice of God makes audible through the noise of Finnegan's fall. Narrative movement begins with the life, fall, and wake of Hod-carrier Finnegan, pages 4 to 7. The wake scene fades into the landscape of Dublin and environs. We've just heard how he fell from the ladder. Now we move into a description of the wake, and there's a certain voice that appears at certain times. It's where there are a lot of words ending in ation, continuation of the celebration until the examination of the extermination. These are the 12 judges. Each character, when they appear, has a certain tempo to their character. So when that tempo enters the text, you know the character is present, even though there may be no trace. For example, Anna Livia Plurabel's tempo is the tempo of the hen. Here a little, there a little, go a little, see a little, do a little. The hen is scratching. This is this nervous, bird-like. That's Anna Livia's signature. Here's just one paragraph from the wake scene, which builds and has quite a minor amount of humor associated with it. I should say, Makul or whaya didi day of a trying Thursday morning, sobs they sided at Finnegan's Chrysamoros wake, all the hooligans of the nation prostrated in their consternation, and their duodismally proflusive plethora of ululation. There was plums and groons and cherries and citherers and raiders and cinnamon too, and they all joined in with the shoutmost joviality, Agog and Magog, and the round of them agrog, to the continuation of that celebration until Hand and Hungan's extermination. Some in kink and chorus, more can Keenan, belling him up and filling him down. He's stiff, but he's steady as Priamolum. 'Twas he was a decent, gay, labouring youth, sharpen his pillow scone, tap up his beer. Where in this whirl will ye hear such a din again? With their deep brow fundigs and the dusty fidelios, they laid him brawn drawn a lang last bed, with a buckalips of fisky for his feet and a barrel-load of Guinness o'er his head, to the total of the fluid hang the twaddle of the fuddle dough. Well, it's a drunken Irish wake. That seems clear. But there are a lot of things going on. Where in this whirl will you hear such a din again? And he's stiff, but he's steady as Priamolam. All this Dionysian and sexual imagery is fully explicit. In some ways, more realized as a character, or more lovable, if that's the word, is Anna Livia Pluribel. I mean, Anna Livia Pluribel is Molly Bloom on acid, basically. I mean, Molly Bloom, we don't lose her outlines. We understand Molly. And because Molly doesn't offer us that much of her own mind, she stands for the eternal feminine, but only in the final soliloquy in Ulysses do we really contact her. Anna Livia, it's her book. It may in fact be her dream, and the whole thing is permeated with her tensions and her cares. As it says, Grandpapas is fallen down, meaning the great Father God is at wake. Grandpapas is fallen down, but Grinny spreads the board, meaning Anna Livia is always there. She's always there. And in the wake, really you could almost say that Molly Bloom's soliloquy has been expanded to 300, 400 pages. And the whole thing is a meditation on the river. The river is the feminine, and the first image in the book and the last image are the image of the river. The river dissolves everything and carries it out to sea. Let me read this description of Anna Livia Pluribel, and then we'll go back to the synopsis. How beautiful and how true to wife of her, when strangely forbidden to steal our historic presence from the past post-propophoticals, so as to will make us all lordy heirs and lady maidennesses of a pretty nice kettle of fruit. She is living in our midst of debt and laughing through all plores for us. Her birth is uncontrollable, with a naparon for her mask and her sabots kicking arias, so ser, so solly. If yous ask me and I sack you, how? Greeks may rise and Troisers fall. She is mercenary. Through the length of the land lies under liquidation, flute, and there's nor a harbow nor an eyebrush on this glabrous place of herschrift. What our Walter shall loan a Vesta and hire some peat and sarch the shores her cockles to heat, and she'll do all a turf woman can to puff the business on. Puff. To puff the blaziness on. Puff, puff. And even if Humphrey shall fall frumpy times as awkward again in the beard's busaloom of all our grand remonstrances, there'll be eggs for the breakers come to mourn him, sunny side up with care. So true it is that there's where's a turnover, the tay is wet too, and when you think you catch sight of a hind, make sure you're cocked by a hen. Well, Nora felt that Jimmy would have been much better as a singer. She so stated that she had great hopes for his voice, and she was a very practical woman, Nora Barnacle. There wasn't a literary bone in her body, I think. I think that's what Joyce loved about her, was that she was the real thing. And all these women, Molly and Olivia, they all are Nora Joyce for sure. He died shortly after it was published, although it had been known in manuscript for over 10 years to the literati of his circle. It was called Work in Progress. And people didn't even know if he was serious or not. And it was very hard to find a publisher. It was a typographical nightmare. Joyce was going blind. And so, trying to keep track of the spelling, and there's hardly a standard spelling in there. There's hardly a word that is not somehow fiddled with and changed around. If you pay attention to what you're calling life as it is, you will discover that it's not a simple thing at all. That it's that it's like this. I mean, I used to say, when you're vacuuming your apartment, Rome falls 9 times an hour. And your job is to notice. And you always do notice, but you never tell yourself that you're noticing. So in the course of a day, I live, and you live, to some degree, the entirety of global civilization. I mean, Rome falls, algebra is discovered, the Turks are beating at the gates of Vienna, and it isn't even 11 a.m. yet, So there is this sense of the co-presence of history. We are imprisoned inside the linear assumption that I'm a person in a place, in a time, I'm alive, most people aren't. But in fact, when you deconstruct all that, that is fiction. And the truth is more this onrushing magma of literary association, and in Ulysses you get an enormous amount of half-baked science. Leopold Bloom is always looking at things and explaining to himself how they work using very crackpotted notions of hydraulics and electricity and this sort of thing. I think, people say the psychedelic experience is hard to remember, dreams are hard to remember, but harder to remember than either of those is simply ordinary experience. You lie in the baths, and you close your eyes for 30 seconds, and empires fall, dynastic families unfold themselves, power changes hands, princes are beheaded, a pope disgraced, so forth. That was for you. And and then somebody drops something, and you wake up, and 15 seconds have passed. That's the reality of life, but we suppress this chaotic, irrational side. The genius of Joyce, and to some degree, although in a more controlled form, Proust, and then there were other practitioners, Faulkner certainly, was what they called stream of consciousness. But what it was an ability to actually listen to the associating mind without trimming, pruning, judging, denying. One of the great puzzles to me is the great antagonism between Jung and Joyce, because you would have thought that they would have been comrades in arms. But Joyce loathed psychoanalysis. He
thought that to use all this material to elucidate imagined pathologies was a very uncreative use of it, and that it should all be fabricated into literature. It's very hard to surpass. Thomas Pynchon, William Gaddis, these people, everybody genuflects to Joyce, but very few people plow in the way he did. I mean, Thomas Pynchon is considered a difficult, hallucinatory writer, and there isn't 20 pages in Gravity's Rainbow as obscure as a randomly chosen page here. I can understand the impulse to want to get the universe into a book, because it hints at something that we've talked about in some of these circles, or whatever they are, which is that the character of life is like a work of literature. We are told that you're supposed to fit your experience into the model which science gives you, which is probabilistic, statistical, predictable, and yet it's the felt datum of experience is much more literary than that. I mean, we fall in love, we make and lose fortunes, we inherit houses in Scotland, we lose everything, we get terrible diseases, we're cured of them, or we die of them. But it all has this Strom und Drang aspect to it, which physics is not supposed to have, but which literature always has. And I think that, I don't know if it's true, but I think what Joyce believed, and what I'm willing to entertain at some depth, is the idea that salvation is somehow an act of encompassing comprehension. That salvation is an actual act of apprehension, of understanding, and that this act of apprehension involves everything. This is why the alchemic, before James Joyce and this kind of literature, the only place where you got these kinds of constructs was in alchemy and magic. The idea that, through an act of magic, the universe could be condensed to yield a fractal microcosm of itself. Well, then what Joyce is saying is that the novel, which was unknown in the alchemical era, the novel comes later, I mean, arguably, but the real zest for the novel comes in the 19th century, that the novel is the alchemical retort into which these theories of how things work can be cast. I think the great modern exponent of this, although now dead, and certainly one who owed an enormous debt to Joyce, was Vladimir Nabokov, especially in Ada. Ada is his paean of praise to Finnegan's Wake, basically, and the idea tacked in there is the idea of causality and ordinary casuistry. See, what all these people are saying, I think, and what the psychedelic experience argues for as well, is that we are somehow prisoners of language, and that somehow, if we are prisoners of language, then the key which will set us loose is somehow also made of language. What else could fit the lock? So somehow an act of poetic legerdemain is necessary. And Joyce, in Finnegan's Wake, I mean, he didn't live to argue the case or to work it out. He died shortly after. But this comes about as close as anybody ever came to actually pushing the entire contents of the universe down into about 14 cubic inches. Joyce and Proust had one meeting, and supposedly Joyce said to Proust, "I'm too young for you to teach me anything." Are you all familiar with the remembrance of things past? Well, it could hardly be a more different work of literature. I mean, it is stately and cinematic, and you always know where you are, and the characters are defined. It's an old-style novel, but there are places in it where he just takes flight and prefigures the kind of writing that Faulkner and Joyce were able to do. As far as psychedelic influences, I don't know that there are arguably any. Joyce lived in Trieste for a while and taught English. He may have been, as a habitué of Paris, he may have been familiar with hashish. He probably had some familiarity with absinthe, but I doubt that it was a lifestyle for him. I think that the whole of the 20th century is informed by this hyperdimensional understanding, and that, Jung tapping into it in the 20s, the Dadaists in 1919 in Zurich, the Surrealists, even earlier, the École de Pataphysique, L'Entrement, Jarry, all of these people. It's what it's about, the 20th century, is this, the McLuhan's phrase comes to mind, the Gutenberg galaxy, the spectrum of effects created by print. The classes, the conceits, the industries, the products, the attitudes, the garments, all of the things created by print. And we are living in a terminal civilization. I mean, I don't want to say dying, because civilizations aren't animals, but we are living in an age of great self-summation, when what we look back at is basically since the fall of Rome, there has been an unbroken working out of certain themes. Scholasticism, the Aristotelian and Platonic corpuses. Christianity, always presented as somehow a rival to science, is in fact paves the way for science. There would have been no science had there not been William of Ockham, who was a 14th century nominalist theologian. Really, Western civilization has had 1,000 years to work its magic, and now there is a summation underway, and I don't certainly presume, at least not this evening, to judge it. How do you place a value on an entire civilization? But in the same way that when a person dies, their entire life passes before them in review. When a civilization dies, it hypnagogically cycles the detritus of centuries and centuries of struggle to understand. And someone like Joyce, I think, just brings that to an excruciating climax, because it's all there, it's all there. From the smile that tugs at the lips of the woman in the Arnolfini wedding, to quantum physics, to what Molière said to his niece in the 15th letter, and so forth and so on. And the task is to hold it in your mind. I think it was William James who said, if we don't read the books with which we carefully line our apartments, then we're no better than our dogs and cats. And, too often this is lost sight of. And the point of it, it's not simply that we are aesthetes, littérateurs, and that here in the twilight of the gods we should sit around reading James Joyce. That isn't the point. The point is that this is the distillation of our experience of what it is to be human, and it's out of these kinds of distilling processes that we can launch some kind of new dispensation for the human enterprise, because we have played it out. It's now a set piece, all of it. I mean, when I listen to rock and roll now, it's interesting to me, but it has the completedness of polyphony. It's a done deal somehow. And we're looking backward, and we're anticipating. And the purpose of literature, I think, is to illuminate the past and to give a certain guidance as we move into the future. And this book, by being at first so opaque and so challenging to aesthetic canons and social values, eventually emerges as a very prescient insight into our circumstance. The Ballad of Finnegan's Wake has hundreds of verses, and in an Irish pub it can keep people going all night long. It's a celebration of complexity and of the human journey, and Joyce doesn't judge. I mean, it says somewhere in Finnegan's Wake, here in Moycane, which is the red light district of Dublin, here in Moycane we flop on the seamy side. But up Nient, prospector, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. So if you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked. That's that passage about death. Here in Moycane we flop on the seamy side. But up Nient, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. It was a very optimistic, transformative sort of vision. Somehow complexity is the ocean we have to learn to surf.
That's the river.
Yes, that's the river. And that's the psychedelic side of it. I mean, imagine that you can get 63,000 different words in here, tell a story, and have all the common articles and modifiers operating normally anyway. And then it's very optimistic. I mean, Molly Bloom's speech is, probably the single most optimistic outpouring in all of 20th century literature. Not that there was much competition, but... Yes, the final affirmation, yes. Sam Beckett, Nobel Prize winner, genius in his own right, but secretary to James Joyce for many, many years, and passionately in love with Joyce's tragically schizophrenic daughter. One of the, you want an unhappy story, the story of Sam. You'll find out why Sam Beckett is not exactly laughing all the time in his work. A very, very complex relationship to Joyce's schizophrenic child. Joyce's family life was not very happy. I think he had a wonderfully sensuous life with Nora, but I don't know what it would be like to be the guy who wrote this book and live with a woman who thought you would be better off as a saloon singer. Not exactly a saloon singer. I mean, he did, but still. Shall I try and find a passage? Let us now
weather, health, dangers, public orders, and other circumstances permitting, of perfectly convenient if you police, after you, police, pardoning mine, ich bin so freisch bei, drop this jitter-pokery and talk straight turkey, mate to mate. For while the ear, be we milk-alls or Nicholists, may sometimes be inclined to believe others, the eye, whether browned or nolanced, finds it devilish hard now and again even to believe itself. Habeus aures et nun vidibis, habeus oculos ad hoc manus polypobatus. Tip, drawing nearer to take our slant at it, since after all it has met with misfortunes while all underground. Let us see all there may remain to be seen. But I am a worker, a tombstone mason, anxious to please Avery Buries, and Julie glad when Christmas comes his once a year. You are a poor Jewist, unctuous to police nopey bobbies, and tunny belly solely when 'tis thine took or home gin. We cannot say eye to eye. We cannot smile nose from nose. Still, one cannot help noticing that rather more than half of the lines run north-south in the Nemzis and Bucharest directions, while the others go west-east in search from Malazi's via Bulgarad for Tiny Tot, though it looks when Schwamp-Humpsling, alongside other incunabula, it has its cardinal points for all of that. Tip,